Hello everyone, welcome to our first lecture on basic cell structure and function. So in this lecture we're going to cover a lot. We'll cover the basic cell theory, the basics of cytology, and the structure of the plasma membrane. So basic cell theory. So basic cell theory is kind of like, why should we care about cells? Like, why do we even pay attention to them in an anatomy class? Well, it's really because of these three tenets of the cell theory. So the first is that cells are the smallest living units, which we kind of mentioned in our introduction, right? But a little bit more details. These cells are going to be the smallest structures that perform all functions required to be considered a living thing, right? They get nutrients from their environment, they produce waste, they use the respiratory gases, they reproduce themselves all on their own. So they do all these important things and many more that I'm not mentioning that would make them what we would consider a living thing. And they're the smallest things that do that. Next is that all living things are composed of cells. So no matter what you look at, every living thing is composed of cells. Some organisms are single-celled organisms. Basically, the whole organism is just one cell. These are called unicellular organisms. And then you have us, right? And a bunch of other organisms like us, which are made of multiple cells, right? It's not just one cell that makes up the organism. It's multiple cells making up tissues, which make up organs, which make up organ systems, which make up the organism, right? Those are multicellular organisms like us. The final tenet of the cell theory is actually going to be the one that we're going to talk about quite a bit in this course. This is the idea that all cells come from pre-existing cells. So that means, if you have any kind of cell, like when we talk about keratinocytes in skin or osteocytes in bone, those cells had to come from some parent cell, some other cell before them. Now, the process that does that, where you take this one parent cell and you go through this division process to produce two identical daughter cells, this process is called mitosis. Okay? Now, this is important because basically all the cells in the human body are going to be derived from the single cell, which is the fertilized egg, or what is called zygote. So you can see a sperm fertilizing an egg here, forming a zygote. And then basically what happens early on in development is there's a bunch of mitosis, a bunch of cell division, and it produces like a ball of cells. So each of these cells came from that fertilized egg, right? So all the cells in your body really originally come from that fertilized egg. And that means, at the minimum, all 10 trillion cells all 10 trillion cells in your body derive from a single cell. And we get that by this process of mitosis. Okay? So mitosis is going to be a form of cell division for growth and repair in the human body. There are some important characteristics of mitosis that you'll see in your notes. These are that one parent cell divides to produce two daughter cells. Okay? There's other forms of cell division that produce four daughter cells. So it's important you remember mitosis produces two. The two daughter cells that are produced at the end of mitosis are identical to the parent cell in every way. And so sometimes the daughter cells are called clones. Right? And again, there's another form of cell division where that's not true. So you have to remember that that is a property of mitosis. Okay? So like you see in this image, these first daughter cells from that fertilized egg, from that zygote, are going to be identical. And you look at them, they all look the same, right? Because structurally and functionally, they are the same. Okay? Now, what we know is that if we look at cells throughout the body, they're not all the same, right? And they're not all going to look like these early cells here. They look totally different. So how do we get from these early cells to these, this diversity of cells that we have throughout the body? Okay? So these first cells are going to change over time due to differences in the environment, differences in signals that they receive. This process of changing the structure and function of cells is what we call cell differentiation. Okay? And cell differentiation, the changing of these cells, is driven by the environment around them. Okay? So these early cells, or even some later cells that haven't fully changed yet, that haven't really decided what they're going to become yet, another way of saying that is that these cells are undifferentiated. They haven't differentiated yet. They haven't decided what they're going to be. Those kinds of cells are called stem cells. And stem cells come in different types. There's some that can become absolutely anything, but there are also some stem cells that are a little bit more decided and can only become certain things. We're not going to really talk about that distinction. Just in general, you should know that stem cells can become, something other than what they are. And you can use stem cells, and this is where we'll talk about this often, to replace basically your old cells. And they serve as a constant source of, say, epithelial cells or, muscle tissue cells, right? Over the course of your lifetime. All right, so next is just to quickly define cytology. So cytology is the study of cell structure, or in other words, this is cellular anatomy. So this is where you kind of study, the internal structure of the cells. So our cells are what are called eukaryotic cells, and eukaryotic cells have internal structures called organelles. And the name kind of literally means small organs, because when people first started looking in cells and seeing these things, they're like, oh, these are like the organs on the inside of the cell. So they called them that. They called them little organs or organelles. Okay? And these organelles are going to perform specific functions within the cell. So they're like little compartments. And think about it. Whenever you have some kind of functioning building, say, let's say like your house, for example, right? You have a functioning building that is your house. Your house is not one big room, right, where everything is done willy-nilly, right? Your house has rooms. It has compartments that are specialized for specific tasks, right? You only cook in the kitchen. You only sleep in the bedroom, right? The organelles inside the cell are like little rooms where specific tasks take place. Now, some of these organelles are going to be surrounded by one or two biological membranes. These are called membranous organelles. Some organelles on the inside of the cell are not going to be surrounded by a membrane at all. So these are called non-membranous organelles. Now, really the first organelle to talk about is not really, lumped into one of those two classes, not really a membranous or a non-membranous. It's really the membrane that sort of makes up the wall of all of these, or the membrane of all of these membranous organelles, and then also the membrane of the cell itself. So this is called a plasma membrane. So the plasma membrane is a strict barrier that divides the two major fluid compartments in the body. Okay? So this is kind of like a little detour here to talk about plasma membrane, and then also the fluid compartments that it divides. So the plasma membrane, so if you look at this cell here, right, the plasma membrane is going to be the boundary around the outside, and it's going to separate the fluid inside this cell from all this fluid outside the cell. So you have these two fundamental fluid compartments, what's called the intracellular fluid and the extracellular fluid, what's inside the plasma membrane and what's outside the plasma membrane. So the intracellular fluid is sometimes called cytoplasm. The intracellular fluid is actually, believe it or not, even though we think of it as very small, the intracellular fluid compartment is the largest fluid compartment in the body. And you see that here, right? 67% of the water in your body is inside your cells. Now, how is that the case, right? I can give you a number. The average volume of fluid inside a single cell is about 10 nanoliters. Nano is 10 to the minus 9. It's a very, very, very small volume of fluid inside here. So how is it that that fluid makes up 67% of all the water in our body? The answer is in the number. how many of these 10 nanoliter cells are there in the body. You got to take that 10 nanoliters and multiply it by at least 10 trillion. So then all of a sudden you can see, oh, just there's so many of these cells that even though the amount of water inside is very small, if there's just so many of them, it makes up this large volume of water in the body. Now, cytoplasm and cytosol are actually not the same thing. Cytoplasm refers to all of the fluid inside the cell, the fluid between the organelles, and also the fluid in the organelles. So that's cytoplasm. Cytosol really just more specifically refers to the fluid between the organelles, not the fluid inside the organelles. Okay, so there's kind of an important distinction there. Okay. The second fluid compartment is the extracellular fluid compartment. This is all the fluid outside your cells. Now you don't see that here, and that's because the extracellular fluid is itself divided into two compartments. So basically the dividing line, or what divides the extracellular fluid, is the walls of blood vessels, particularly the walls of capillaries. So you'll have the extracellular fluid that makes up the inside of your blood, and then the extracellular fluid that's immediately around the cells themselves. So the extracellular fluid immediately around the cells themselves is called interstitial fluid. And interstitial fluid is the second largest fluid compartment, about 26% of body fluid. The fluid inside your blood is called plasma, or blood plasma. And believe it or not, that's actually the absolute smallest body fluid compartment. That's where you have the least amount of fluid in your body. It's in your blood. And I know for many of you, if you had walked into the classroom and I asked just, point blank to everybody before we even started this, where do you have most of the water in your body? I guarantee you there's a lot of people who have this misconception that it would be in blood because that's what we can see. But it could not be further from the truth. Okay? So you have the blood plasma, the interstitial fluid, and they're separated by this wall of the capillary. It's called the capillary endothelium, that wall that separates them. Okay? Now, one of the things I want to emphasize is that the composition, the stuff that you're going to find in extracellular fluid and intracellular fluid are really, really different. We won't go into that here, but when you take physiology, you absolutely will go into those differences. But the differences between plasma and interstitial fluid is actually there's not very many differences between them. So these two fluids here are really similar, but the extracellular fluid and the intracellular fluid are actually not really similar. Okay?